The diner was unusually still that morning, the kind of quiet that lets you hear every tiny sound. The hiss of the coffee machine, the clink of forks against porcelain plates, the soft hum of an old jukebox that hadn't played a tune in weeks. Outside, the sun had just started breaking through the fog that hung low over the small town of Maple Ridge. Its light poured through the diner's wide windows, glinting off the polished chrome edges of the counters and dancing across the rows of salt shakers and napkin holders. At his usual booth by the window sat Henry Lawson, an 82-year-old Korean War veteran who came here every single morning, without fail, at exactly 8:10 a.m. He liked routine. The waitress always had his black coffee ready before he even asked. He always sat on the same side of the booth, facing the door, just like soldiers do, never with their back to an entrance. Henry wore his favorite old flannel shirt. The red pattern faded from years of washing. His boots were scuffed, their leather cracked from decades of winters and miles on dusty roads. When he lifted his cup, his hand trembled just a bit, a faint echo of the battles long past. But his eyes, those carried the calm strength of a man who had once seen fear and refused to bow to it. For Henry, mornings like these were sacred, simple, peaceful, predictable. Until that morning, when peace was broken in an instant. A young man at the counter had been arguing with the waitress, loudly. His voice carried through the small diner, cutting through the low murmur of morning conversations like a jagged knife. He was in his late 20s, maybe 30 at most, the kind of man who looked like he'd been fighting life since the day he could stand. Broad-shouldered, his neck thick and red from anger, a baseball cap turned backward, and a cheap leather jacket that squeaked every time he moved. He slapped his palm against the counter, the sound sharp enough to make the cook in the kitchen glance up from the grill. "I said I gave you a 20, he barked. "You're trying to shortchange me." The waitress, young, maybe 22, had been working the early shift alone since 5 in the morning. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun, her name tag crooked and smudged with coffee stains. She tried to explain again, her voice trembling but polite. "Sir, you gave me a 10, not a 20. I double-checked the register." But people like him didn't want explanations. They wanted to win. And pride, when mixed with exhaustion and cheap caffeine, can turn even the smallest disagreement into a declaration of war. As the man's voice grew louder, the diner's quiet rhythm broke. The old couple by the window stopped eating. A truck driver at the next table looked up, fork still halfway to his mouth. Even the radio behind the counter seemed quieter, the old country tune fading beneath the sound of anger. Henry lifted his eyes from his cup. He didn't say anything, just watched. He'd seen this before, too many times. When men let pride rule them, it never ends well. There was no judgment in Henry's gaze, just a tired sort of understanding, the kind that comes from surviving both war and life itself. But to a man already embarrassed in public, even a calm glance can feel like an attack. The thug noticed. His head jerked toward Henry, and in that instant their eyes met, one pair young, wild, and filled with insecurity, the other old, steady, and quietly unshaken. That look, that simple, harmless look, felt to the younger man like a spotlight on his weakness. Something deep inside him recoiled. It wasn't defiance that he saw in Henry's eyes. It was worse. Indifference. That kind of calm drives insecure men mad. "Got a problem, old man?" The stranger barked, his voice sharp enough to draw everyone's attention. The waitress tried to step in. "Sir, please, just calm down. It's not worth—" "Shut up!" he snapped, slamming his fist on the counter again. The plates rattled. A spoon clattered to the floor. Henry said nothing. He simply shook his head, the motion slow, deliberate, as if to say, "You're not worth the fight." Then he turned his eyes back to his coffee. That simple gesture, turning away, was the match that lit the fuse. The man's face turned crimson. He puffed out his chest, his jaw tightening like a spring. To him, the old man's calm wasn't wisdom. It was mockery. And mockery, in his fragile world, demanded punishment. "Don't look down on me, you old piece of—" he started. But before the sentence could finish, he was already moving. He stormed across the narrow aisle between tables, his heavy boots thudding against the tile. A coffee mug toppled as he brushed past a waitress tray, sending hot liquid spilling across the floor. Then, crack! His open palm struck Henry across the face. The sound was deafening in the small space. It echoed off the walls, off the metal napkin holders, off the glass windows where sunlight had just begun to shine. Every fork froze mid-air, every breath caught in every throat. The smell of pancakes and coffee hung heavy, suddenly replaced by the metallic tension of fear. Henry's head snapped to the side. His cheek burned red, and for a long, suspended moment, the world seemed to stand still. Even the young man looked uncertain now, like he hadn't expected it to sound so loud or feel so final. Henry didn't move right away. He just sat there, his chest rising and falling slowly, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted it to his face. He wasn't trembling from fear. He was trembling from disbelief. Not at the pain, he'd endured worse on battlefields long ago, but at the cruelty of it, at how cheaply violence could come in a world that used to hold respect sacred. He stared down into his cup, coffee rippling from the shockwave of the blow. Tiny black circles spread and vanished, like the last traces of peace fading from that morning. If you believe no one deserves to be treated this way, and that respect for our elders still matters, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. It helps this message reach more people who believe in kindness over cruelty. Let's remind the world that compassion still exists. The waitress gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. For a split second, she didn't breathe. The tray she'd been holding wobbled, plates clinking softly before she set it down with trembling fingers. The entire diner froze in a kind of stunned paralysis. A fork clattered to the floor somewhere in the back. The smell of fried bacon and coffee seemed to hang heavier in the air, as though even the scent itself was holding its breath. A young mother at the corner booth pulled her little boy closer. The boy whispered something, but she just shook her head, eyes fixed on the man who'd done it. A truck driver near the door shifted uneasily, his massive hands tightening around his cup, knuckles white, but still he didn't move. None of them did. Because in that fragile moment, no one wanted to be the first to break the silence. The world has grown too used to it, this silence in the face of wrong, the kind where everyone knows what's right, but no one wants to pay the price of doing it. Henry didn't speak either. He simply sat there, hand pressed gently to his cheek, eyes lowered to the table. His coffee, once steaming hot, now sat untouched, a thin film forming across the surface. The bruise on his face darkened by the minute, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid. Fear was something he'd left behind decades ago, in muddy trenches and smoke-filled valleys half a world away. What filled his chest now wasn't fear. It was sorrow. A deep, aching sorrow for what the world had become, for how men had forgotten honor, for how quick people were to look away when kindness was most needed. The waitress hesitated, wanting to go to him, but her legs wouldn't move. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Sir, are you all right?" Henry looked up for the first time since the strike. His eyes were tired, yes, but there was no anger in them, only a weary sort of peace. "I've been through worse, dear," he said softly. His voice was quiet but steady, like the voice of someone who had already forgiven what the world refused to understand. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20, Outside, the sunlight shifted, spilling longer shadows across the diner floor. Customers paid their bills in silence, one by one slipping out the door, unable to face the guilt of staying. The man who had struck him was gone too, his chair left crooked at the counter, a few dollar bills tossed carelessly beside an empty plate. He'd walked out muttering curses, the doorbell jingling behind him, leaving behind only the echo of his cruelty. Henry stayed. Not because he couldn't stand, but because his legs felt like they were carrying more years than ever before. He leaned back slightly in the booth, watching the sunlight glimmer faintly on the window pane. That diner had been his refuge. Every morning for years, he'd sat in that very seat, the one by the window where he could watch the street and nod to passing strangers. It was where people still called him Sir, where someone always asked how he was holding up, even if they didn't expect a long answer. It was a small thing, but for an old man who had lost so much to time, that simple routine meant everything. Now, even that sacred space felt tainted, like the peace had been pulled out from under him. The laughter that once filled the diner was gone, replaced by a quiet that felt too heavy to breathe in. Henry reached for his cup again, took one small sip, cold, bitter, and set it back down. He stared into it, as if searching for something inside the reflection. Some reason why cruelty had to find its way even here. The old clock above the counter ticked loudly, its rhythmic click echoing like footsteps in an empty hallway. Each second felt longer than the last. Then, just as the weight of that silence became unbearable, the bell above the diner's door jingled. The waitress looked up first. Then the few remaining customers turned, eyes narrowing as sunlight poured through the doorway, casting tall shadows across the floor. A group of men stepped inside. Their presence was immediate, commanding, like the sound of a thunderstorm rolling in on a clear day. They moved with quiet certainty, boots striking the tile in unison, leather vests creaking softly with each step. The air changed. Every head turned. Even the faint music from the radio seemed to fade away. Embroidered across their backs was a name everyone recognized: Hell's Angels. The waitress instinctively backed up, nervously glancing toward Henry. She didn't know what to expect, but something in the way they entered didn't feel hostile. It felt purposeful. The men didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their silence carried weight, the kind that made the world pay attention. At the center of them walked a tall man, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes sharp but not cruel. There was a tired strength in the way he carried himself, the kind born from years on the road and lessons learned the hard way. He scanned the room slowly, taking in every detail: the frightened waitress, the overturned chair, the cold cup of coffee still resting on the table. Then his gaze landed on Henry. And just like that, his whole expression changed. The hardness in his eyes softened, and the faintest flicker of recognition crossed his face. A look that told everyone watching that this wasn't just another stop for him. This was personal. That man was Michael Lawson, Henry's son. The two hadn't spoken in years, not out of hatred, but out of the long, quiet distance that forms when pride stands between love and apology. Michael had left home young, angry, restless, and burning for freedom. His father's world of rules and duty felt too small for him then. He'd wanted the open road, the wind, the sound of engines instead of lectures. The biker life gave him what he thought he needed: a brotherhood, loyalty, a place to belong. But beneath the noise of roaring engines and flashing headlights, he'd often felt something missing, something he could never quite name. He would later realize it was his father's voice, the same voice that once taught him right from wrong, and how to look a man in the eye when you shake his hand. Now, seeing Henry there, bruised, silent, and older than he remembered, that missing piece fell back into place. The wall between them, years thick, cracked and crumbled without a single word. The young thug was still in the diner, leaning against the counter, smirking at his phone, completely unaware that the man who had just walked in was about to change everything. Michael's boots echoed softly against the tile as he walked toward his father's booth. The air felt heavy, charged, like the seconds before a storm. He stopped at the edge of the table, his hand hesitating for just a moment before he sat down across from Henry. Neither spoke. Michael reached out, his rough, calloused hand, scarred from years of hard living, covering his father's trembling one. Henry looked up, and for a long, still moment the diner disappeared. It was just them, father and son, one scarred by time, the other by life. And in that silence, without a single apology spoken, they understood each other completely. The air felt different now. The waitress could sense it too, like something sacred was happening quietly, right before everyone's eyes. The thug finally noticed. He turned around, saw the leather vests, the tattoos, the cold, watchful eyes staring back at him. He laughed nervously. "What? You need your biker gang to protect you now, old man?" he sneered. A few customers gasped. The waitress took a small step back. Even the cook leaned forward behind the counter, wiping his hand slowly on his apron. Michael didn't move. He didn't rise. He didn't even blink. He just stared at the man, his expression calm, but carved with quiet fury. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, low but carrying the weight of something immovable. "That man you hit," he said slowly, "is my father." The words dropped into the silence like heavy stones. "He's 82 years old. He's a veteran who gave this country more than you'll ever understand. And you thought it made you tough to slap him?" The thug's grin faltered, but Michael wasn't finished. "You see, my old man fought real battles. He faced fear head-on so people like you could live without knowing what courage truly costs. And this is how you repay men like him? With disrespect?" Not one biker behind him moved a muscle. They didn't have to. Their silence said it all. The young man's eyes darted around the room. Every face, the waitress, the customers, even the cook, was fixed on him now. He could feel the judgment pressing down like a weight on his chest. His hand twitched as if to speak, but no words came. His throat tightened. He looked at Michael, then at Henry, and suddenly, all the power he thought he had drained out of him. Without another word, he took a step back, then another, mumbling something under his breath before pushing through the diner door. The bell above it jingled one last time, and the sound felt like the closing of a chapter. No one followed him. No one needed to. His shame would follow him farther than any man could. Michael turned back to his father. For the first time that morning, Henry exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry years of pain and pride out with it. He smiled faintly, the corners of his lips trembling. His son hadn't defended him with fists or fury, but with dignity, and that meant more than anything. The waitress, still trembling, brought over 2 fresh cups of coffee. "On the house," she whispered, her voice shaking as she set them down. Michael nodded, his rough voice gentle. "Thank you, ma'am." Around them, customers began to stir again, some murmuring quietly, some approaching the booth with lowered heads and words of apology. A few couldn't find the courage to speak. They just nodded to the old man, their eyes saying what their lips could not. Henry accepted it all with grace. He had no bitterness left, only a deep, tired peace. He turned to his son and said softly, "I fought battles long ago, Michael, but the hardest one—" He paused, his voice catching slightly. "Is keeping your family close." Michael's eyes glistened. He reached across the table and squeezed his father's hand tighter this time. "I know, Dad," he said quietly. "I should have come back sooner." Henry shook his head. "You came when it mattered." They sat together in silence, not the heavy, suffocating silence from before, but a gentle one. A silence filled with understanding, with love that needed no words. From that day forward, the diner wasn't just a place for breakfast. It became their meeting place, a symbol of reconciliation and quiet strength. Michael and his biker brothers would stop by often, sometimes staying for coffee, sometimes just to make sure the old man got home safely. And every time Henry walked in, people noticed. They stood a little straighter, they spoke a little kinder, because they remembered that morning and how decency found its way back. Henry lived out his remaining years not as the lonely veteran in the corner booth, but as a man reborn in peace, a father who found his son again, and a son who learned that real strength is not in the fists, but in forgiveness. The diner, once just a stop for coffee, became a living memory of that day. The waitresses told the story to new hires, customers whispered it to strangers, and some even brought their children, pointing to the booth by the window. That's where it happened. And when Henry finally passed, the town placed a small brass plaque at that booth. It read, "Here sat Henry Lawson, a man who taught us that silence can be broken, and that kindness still has a place in this world." Michael visited often after that, sometimes alone, sometimes with his brothers. He'd sit quietly in that same booth, a cup of black coffee before him, and smile at the memory of his father, the man who taught him that love doesn't fade, it just waits for the right moment to return. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. Stories like this remind us that even in a world that often feels cruel, acts of loyalty, respect, and love can still heal what once seemed broken. And before we end, tell us in the comments, do you believe compassion can bring families back together? Your words might inspire someone who needs hope today.